Good morning, everyone. All right, so let's go through this prong setting again. I've got some questions about how to know how deep to make these prongs. So I have a little Char white purple stone here. It's rectangle. It's 3/4 of an inch tall by 1/2 inch wide. And for these prongs, what also concerns me is the depth of the stone. So if I hold my stone just even up to my cry-cut board, these are all 1/4 inch marks, okay? I can see that my stone is quite thick. It's probably 6 millimeters here because it's 1/4 of an inch. I believe there's like 6.2, maybe 6.3, some 6 point something millimeters to 1/4 of an inch. All right, so you can measure with a caliper if you have one. I'll pull my little metal one out. These are inexpensive. They make them digital also. I don't know where my digital one is, but you can use this to measure the depth of the stone. Down here there are millimeter marks, right? So if I open this up and I come down very lightly on the middle of my stone there, I can see that it is exactly 6 millimeter. My 6 millimeter mark aligns with my first mark down here, and I can also see that it's 1/4 of an inch because the inch marks are up here, and here's my mark. So 1/4 of an inch, just a smidge, or right at, or maybe even an under, my glasses are foggy. So right about 6 millimeter, 1/4 of an inch, okay? So if I were to just put the teeth down on these 1/4 inch marks, I can see that that aligns with what my inches say as well. So this stone is about 6 millimeters, or according to my caliper here, 6 millimeters thick. What that means for my prongs, depending on what wire I'm using and what combination of wires, is that ultimately when I hold this band of wires up next to my stone, I'm holding two 20 gauge round wires, and they cover, probably half of the edge of my stone. My stone is 6 millimeters thick from the belly, from the center belly to the bottom. My prong has to make it over this edge, just to the top of the side of the belly, right here, the soft shoulder to hold in, and maybe even a little bit more. I normally gauge by, looking here and thinking, okay, if I use these two wires, I can use my 4 millimeter plier head, and that should make a prong that will go over the top of this shoulder and land right about here. I can visually just see that, right? If I take two more 20 gauge wires and I make a stack of 4, and let's say the upper wire I intend to be my prong wire, well then my prong doesn't need to be 4 millimeter big, does it? It just barely needs to be a 2 millimeter prong, and it would probably even at that lay flat on the edge of my stone. So probably for this one, depending on what gauge wires I want and depending on how big I want my prongs, see, if I used 3 of them here, then I could use a 2 millimeter prong head and come over that shoulder, right? So, and if I increase the sizes of these wires from 20 gauge, say, to 18 gauge, and I mix them, then I might, stick with 2 of them, and my bottom wire, since it would be a little bit thicker, would ride a little bit higher on the side here. And so again, probably my 4 millimeter prong would still be what I use if I use 2 wires. So I hope that explains a little bit about how I figure out the depth. 18 gauge wires are almost 1 millimeter, or probably a little bit bigger than 1 millimeter, and 20 gauge is just slightly smaller. So if I put, these are 1/4 inch marks on my cry-cut board, if I align 4 20 gauge wires here, I can see that it's probably not quite 1/4 of an inch, just over 1/4 of an inch. But here's another one. So it would probably take 6 of these to get me to my 1/4 inch. So 20 gauge is about 1 millimeter thick. It's a smidge smaller, but 6 of these is about 1/4 of an inch, and I can see that here. Okay. If I scale my wire up to 18, and here's some 18 gauge wire that I have. So here I have 4 pieces of 18 gauge wire, and if I lay them down on my cry-cut board, I can see that it's probably 5 of them that will cover 1/4 of an inch. Okay, because I would need one more probably to make it to there. I know it's a simple way to figure out, thicknesses of wire, but sometimes it just helps us to get a visual rather than doing the math. So here goes, 5 18 gauge wires side by side is a breadth smaller than 1/4 of an inch. Okay, and it'll be 6 of the 20 gauge wires, and it'll be a breadth smaller than 1/4 of an inch. All right, you guys. So hopefully that'll help you figure out some measure.